100 years ago, in 1925, Spain wore many faces at once. It was a country of sun-baked plazas and shadowed alleyways, of gilded bullrings and dusty fields, of music and painting, of laughter and fear. To look at Spain that year is to look at a nation poised on a knife's edge. A place where old worlds and new collided, where the future was being sketched in hurried, uncertain lines. This is the story of that year. The currents beneath the surface, the people who felt them, and the small, telling moments that would, in time, become the tremors of a much larger upheaval. Spain in 1925 was at once timeless and modern. Horses still pulled carts through market squares. At the same time, trams and motor cars threaded the broad boulevards of Madrid and Barcelona. Radios were rare but electric. Newspapers were plentiful and fierce. Cafés served both the gossip of the neighborhood and the essays of rising intellectuals. Flamenco singers practiced long into the night in Andalusian courtyards, while in an artist's studio, somewhere in Barcelona or Paris, a painter was bending the very idea of form. Culture in Spain was combustible. It burned bright, even as darker embers smoldered beneath. At the center of Spain's uneasy.com stood a man who had once promised order, General Miguel Primo de Rivera. He had taken power in a coup, declaring a need to restore stability and to sweep away corruption. To some, he was a necessary hand on a shaky wheel, a figure who might hope to slide into chaos. To others, he was the first step toward a silence that would entrench power in the hands of a few and stifle the voices of many. Under his rule, the Constitution lay idle. Parliaments met less often, and the machinery of the state tightened around the public life of cities and towns. Primo de Rivera's Spain was one of contrasts. On the surface, there was discipline and the performance of strength. Parades down broad avenues, regimented public ceremonies, official proclamations promising progress. Yet even as banners flew, the foundations beneath them were shifting. The rural world, which still held the majority of Spain's people, was strained by low prices and poor harvests. Smallholders and peasants felt the brunt of an economy that rewarded few and demanded much from many. Unemployment gnawed at industrial towns. Strikes simmered, sometimes flaring with sudden violence. In the northern basins of mining country, where coal and iron fed industry, workers organized and argued for more than crumbs. The city and field, worker and landowner, each part of Spanish life tugged in its own direction. Regional identities, long a thread in Spain's tapestry, now showed themselves with sharper edges. Catalonia and the Basque provinces, distinct in language, in history, in industry, wanted a voice that Madrid often refused to grant. In Barcelona, the modernist spirit pulsed through street and salon. Architects, poets, and activists fused design and politics in ways that felt impossible to ignore. In the Basque Country, industry and a fierce local culture gave rise to new political movements that sought autonomy and preservation of identity. The central government, anxious to guard unity, responded with suspicion and sometimes repression. Those responses, even when intended to secure order, often widened the gulf between center and periphery. Spain's monarchy added another complicated chord to this tense harmony. Alfonso XIII, the king, moved among his people with all the worn pomp of a long line of sovereigns. Yet his reign had become a question mark for many. Could a crown anchored in tradition navigate the currents of a modern nation? Alfonso's decisions, the alliances he kept, the generals he favored, shaped the trajectory of the country. For monarchists, the crown was a symbol of continuity. For many Republicans and progressives, it represented an old order that needed changing, and so the king's presence, rather than calming, often reminded Spaniards of the fragile balancing act upon which their daily lives rested. The Spanish press in 1925 was a living thing, loud, partisan, capable of inciting and informing in equal measure. Newspapers crowded the streets, hawkers cried headlines, and readers sought both comfort and confrontation in the ink-smeared pages. Some papers cheered the regime. Others tore into it with relentless criticism. The result was a public sphere alive with debate and accusation. Censorship and control did not silence the press entirely. Rather, they pushed dissent into coded forms, into satire and allegory, into cultural expressions that could say more in a gesture than a headline might dare. Yet for all the gloom, Spain in 1925 was also a time of immense creative energy. Literature, theater, painting, and music fed a nation's appetite for meaning. Young poets like Federico García Lorca walked the streets with notebooks, listening for the music of language. Painters such as Pablo Picasso, though their reputations were already international, continued to push and pull at the limits of form. Flamenco, the raw and intimate music of Andalusia, seeped into cafés and theaters, its rhythms both defiant and devotional. There was, in the culture of the day, a tension between tradition and experimentation, a willingness to wrestle, sometimes violently, with what Spain was and what it might become. Daily life in a Spanish town or village in 1925 carried its own slow dramas. Men and women rose to routines dictated by sun and season. Markets opened early with a shout of vendors and the bright colors of produce. Families gathered for long meals that felt like rites, where food and argument mixed like oil and vinegar. Religion remained woven through everyday life. Church bells marked the rhythm of hours. Processions knitted communities together, and confessionals held the quiet secrets of whole neighborhoods. Yet even these traditions were changing. Urbanization lured people toward the cities, pulling young laborers and hopeful artisans from the land into factories and workshops. The pace of life quickened for some, while others clung to a rural rhythm that had survived centuries. Politics hummed in every corner. In the factories, workers formed unions and debated possibilities. In cafes, intellectuals argued about republicanism, socialism, anarchism. Ideas that in other times might have seemed abstract now had the force of real alternatives. Prisoners in jails and detainees in police stations sometimes became martyrs for causes they could scarcely name. The state's response from propaganda to brutal repression shaped a public mood that could turn fearful, resentful, or fiercely hopeful in the space of a few days. Economic hardship was not an abstract statistic. It was the hunger in a child's stomach, the closed sign in a shop window, the mother's worry over the next rent notice. Spain's economy in 1925 was unevenly developed. While some cities housed flourishing industries and exportable crafts, many regions depended on agriculture, bound to old systems that produced little wealth. Landowners held sway in the countryside, often resistant to reforms that would redistribute power and land. Attempts to modernize agriculture, to bring irrigation and new techniques, were sporadic and frequently blocked by social conservatism. The consequence was a society in which inequality showed itself in both obvious and subtle ways. Foreign influence and international context also pressed upon Spain. Europe, still healing from the wounds of the Great War, offered no simple models. Fascism and authoritarian movements in other nations served both as warnings and as inspirations for different factions within Spain. Economic ties through trade, investment, and cultural exchange pulled Spain into the orbit of broader European trends, while also highlighting its unique path. Emigration, too, continued as a pressure valve. Spaniards boarded ships seeking opportunity abroad, sending back letters that mixed nostalgia, new hopes, and the quiet ache of separation. Religion's role in 1925 was complicated. The Catholic Church remained a pillar of identity for many, but had also become a target for those who saw it as suffused with power. For conservatives, the Church served as an anchor in storms of change. For leftists, it sometimes seemed an obstacle to a more equitable society. Tensions played out in classrooms and in elections, in sermons and in plays, shaping an atmosphere where faith and politics frequently intertwined. Education was a battleground for the future. Schools were places where the state attempted to mold citizens, and where progressive teachers sought to widen horizons. Literacy was growing, but unevenly. A new generation of young Spaniards read works from abroad, learned new sciences, and dreamed of reshaping their country. These dreams, when funneled into organized politics, fed both reformist and revolutionary currents. The classrooms of 1925 were quietly seeding the Spain of 1935 and beyond. Women's lives, too, were at a crossroads. In towns and cities, some women worked in factories, in shops, and as teachers. Others maintained households that were, by necessity, centers of economic as well as domestic activity. The early movements for women's rights and suffrage had begun to stir debates. What role might women play in public life? Would the slow opening of social space allow for expanded agency? Or would long-standing patriarchal structures hold firm? The answers were not yet clear, but the questions themselves marked a notable shift. The military's presence in national life was palpable. Veterans of earlier conflicts, men hardened by fighting and accustomed to the order and hierarchy of military life, often found themselves in positions of influence. The army was both a symbol of national pride and a political force with its own interests. Its role in governance, during and after Primo de Rivera's seizure of power, underlined a truth about Spain. The boundary between civilian rule and military intervention was porous. The army could be called upon in moments of crisis, and its loyalties might tilt the fate of governments. Artists and writers in 1925 found themselves collaborating and colliding in ways that would define Spanish modernism. The avant-garde mingled with folk tradition. Night cafés hosted debates that sometimes burst into action. Theater companies staged plays that questioned assumptions. Poets sent their lines like arrows into public discourse. There was a hunger for renewal, a belief that culture could both reflect and transform society. But culture could also hide contradictions. A painter's radical work might be applauded abroad, while met with silence or suspicion at home. The export of Spanish art often told a different story than the weathered realities of the streets from which the art emerged. The countryside retained its own mysteries and rites. Old festivals continued, rooted in a seasonal logic that had survived centuries. Pilgrimages, saints' days, and harvest feasts kept communities knit together. At the same time, the land's ancient patterns of tenancy, of landlordism, of inherited debt, constrained many lives. Attempts to reform land ownership and to modernize agriculture met resistance from entrenched interests, agrarian unrest, while not always visible in headlines, was a steady undercurrent that would later swell into more overt conflict. In deep ports, ships carried goods and people, and the salt air brought news. Sailors and dock workers lived on the margins, yet were essential to Spain's connections with the world. From Cadiz to Bilbao, ports were places of commerce and of ideas. Men who had traveled the Atlantic returned with stories. Goods from far-off markets appeared on local stalls. Ports were the throbbing arteries through which Spain's economy and imagination both flowed and sometimes choked. And then there was the ordinary human rhythm. The flirtation under a balcony, the whispered argument in a kitchen, the laughter of children racing along cobblestones. These small moments, the minute dramas of everyday life, were the heart of Spain in 1925. They were the reason that politics, art, and history mattered, because they touched, in some way, the lives of mothers and fathers, of cobblers and shopkeepers, of teachers and bakers. To speak of 1925 only in abstract terms is to lose sight of the people who lived it, people who loved, who feared, who hoped, and who were, even in quiet ways, preparing for the storms to come. By the end of that year, the signs of a nation under strain could be read in many places. A speech area strike there, a novel that pushed against propriety, an officer's quiet whisper. Each gesture was a thread in a larger tapestry. Some would fray and be tied off. Others would pull the whole cloth apart. What made 1925 especially poignant was its sense of being a hinge year, an interval where choices and habits consolidated into trajectories that would, within a decade, turn into catastrophe for Spain. The internal tensions of class, region, and ideology, and the external pressures of international trends, created an atmosphere in which small events could become catalysts. But even as we speak of tensions and impending crises, it's crucial not to romanticize suffering. There was joy in Spain in 1925. In music, in food, in friendship, in the way a town gathered for a festival, in the quiet ritual of preparation for a wedding, in the pride of a craftsman who finished a beautiful piece of work. The country's cultural riches were not only balm for anxious hearts, but also a form of resistance. Art and song and story kept memory and identity alive in a world that seemed intent on simplifying everything into black and white. If we return to the image of Spain as a landscape of contrasts, it becomes possible to see why the years that followed were so explosive. A nation in which such vivid art and suffocating repression coexisted could not remain stable indefinitely. The pressures of modernity, economic, social, political, pressed against the hardened walls of tradition. Where those walls gave way, conflict erupted. Where they held, quiet forms of accommodation or compromise emerged. Both pathways contained tragedy and both contained moments of grace. So, what does 1925 teach us? Perhaps it teaches that history is not a single narrative but a braided one. It is made not only of leaders and battles, but of the small, stubborn acts of everyday life. A woman teaching a child to read, a worker organizing for fair wages, a poet composing lines that refuse to be silent. It teaches that a nation's future is always being written in the margins, in the conversations at kitchen tables, in the graffiti on a wall, in the music drifting down an alley at dusk. It teaches that art and politics are rarely separate, that culture can be both mirror and hammer, reflecting what is and shaping what might be. As our voices travel back through a century, what we hear is both the music and the warning. Spain in 1925 was a place of intense feeling and complex contradictions. A country that gave the world genius and also suffered grievous divisions. The story of that year does not end with a single moral, but with an invitation to listen carefully to the subtle signs of a society in motion, and to remember that the choices people make in quieter times can steer the course of nations. Let us hold, then, for a moment, the image of Spain in 1925, a country of narrow streets and wide plazas, of songs that rise like smoke from hearths, of voices that argue and sing and pray. Let us remember the courage of those who spoke when it was risky to speak, the creativity of those who made beauty amid hardship, and the ordinary endurance of a people who rose each morning to make bread, mend roofs, and care for one another. That mixture of resilience, of artistry, of political conflict, is the true heart of that year. In the end, the lesson is both tender and urgent. History is made of human beings. The past was not simply a set of dates on a page, but a living tapestry of choices, mistakes, moments of compassion, and acts of cruelty. Spain in 1925 was no exception. It contained the seeds of tragedy and the seeds of renewal, sometimes in the very same breath. To listen to that year is to hear both a complex, compelling, and deeply human conversation that still speaks to us now, a century later.